Hello, my name is Martin Kelly. I'm senior editor here at Friends Journal, and the current issue, the June-July issue, is on activists versus mystics versus pragmatists. And with me on the line is Lucy Duncan. Lucy works for American Friends Service Committee. She is the director of the Friends Relations Program and has an article there. So welcome, Lucy.
Thanks, Martin.
And I see you're there in the AFSC office. You can see a little bit of the old meeting house there.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
in the peace room.
right. That's a wonderful name.
hmm
And your article here is called Organizing with the Spirit. And tell us a little bit about the beginning. You share a story about Nebraska friends, and you're from Nebraska, and share a little bit about um, what they went through back in the 90s, I guess this was, and how it affected you as well.
So, what I say in the article is Randy Reeves was due for execution. He's the adopted son of Don Reeves, and who at the time actually was serving, I think, as interim director, general secretary for AFSC. And Randy, had been on death row for several years, and his execution was coming up. And he had murdered two people in the Lincoln meeting house when he had been drinking, and he took peyote, and he came to the meeting house, and he murdered two women, um, Janet Lamb, Vicky Lamb, and now I'm sorry, I'm not remembering the names.
Right.
And it impacted the Quaker community quite a bit. And then right after the murder happened, Randy had grown up in Central City meeting. And right after the murder had happened, the next day there was worship in the meeting house. And an elder in the meeting house placed two roses for Janet, who had grown up in the meeting, and for Randy in the meeting house as a sort of sign of forgiveness. And so the Quaker community had been very involved throughout the process. And as the execution started to get closer, there was a lot more activism happening, a lot more focus on it, of course. And I was involved in some of those efforts. And there was this very moving meeting for worship, one of the most powerful meetings for worships that I'd ever experienced, that was in the Lincoln Meeting House. As a public witness, this was people from the public were invited to this meeting for worship. The press was invited, and it was incredibly powerful to be sitting right near the site of the murders and with people from family members of the women who had been murdered, who were there worshiping with us, trying to stop the execution, who didn't see that another murder would heal them. And the ministry was very, very powerful. And I actually offered vocal ministry on that occasion. And it was the first time, I think the only time, that the vocal ministry offered was recorded in a newspaper article
Oh,
after the event. And they weren't allowed to take notes. It was interesting. They didn't take notes, but he recounted it based on his recollection of the event. And then after that, though that got some press, after that, it didn't have the impact of staying the execution. And Mike Johans had just become governor, and Vicky Lamb, Janet Lamb's daughter, who was 2 years old at the time of the murder, came with her father Gus to witness and try to stop the execution. Their family was not in agreement about this whole thing, but they were really clear that this wasn't going to help, and so they came, and three roses became a symbol for the two women who had been murdered, and for Randy of forgiveness. And Vicky tried to go to the governor's office and offer him a rose and speak to him about offering clemency, and the governor wouldn't see her. And so the community gathered together and got 2,000 roses and placed them on the steps of the governor's mansion. And the next day there was a stay of execution. And now Randy is serving two life sentences, not necessarily a way to heal for everyone to heal either.
right.
And recently, the Nebraska has stopped the death penalty. Just very recently,
Yeah, it
they
was
just
just
stopped the death.
a week or two ago. Yeah,
Yeah, just a week or two
amazing.
ago.
Yeah.
And it's a, Quakers, sometimes we like to overestimate our impact, but it would be nice to think that event and that witness had some impact on the general, creating a climate that made that possible in the future.
Sure. Well, and it
Um,
was so tightly weaved into the Quaker community. It was in a Quaker meeting
yes,
house and all these Quakers involved. So it was, I mean, kind of reminds me a little bit when the shootings happened in the Amish schoolhouse and they were having to react. And it wasn't just this philosophical, how would you feel if it was your children? Well, it was here for Nebraska
right, right.
friends.
And it
Yeah.
was very moving to see that. And it was very moving. The sort of consistency and the clarity about it was really very inspiring for me to witness and to see, and also just how grounded in the spirit it was, and how there was such clarity that this was, that the Quaker faith called people to do this. There was no division between, the sense of the spirit being involved and, the sense of this witness that was happening. And I was really moved by that, and moved by, I mean, I haven't been since then to a real public meeting for worship in which that, I mean, I think people do vigils and people worship outside during Occupy, but to have such a powerful action of using worship as the action was also really powerful.
Right. Yeah. So very much tying in what we're talking about in this issue and other articles as well. That activists and we have these sort of sometimes in Quaker meetings, we have the activist side and we have the sort of more mystical side, and sometimes they sort of butt heads a little bit in meetings. But really, I mean, when it works, they fuel each other, both
Yeah,
sides
they really
together.
do, and I think of it as a real
Pretty
cycle, and
powerful.
that,
Yeah.
and there's the thing that, Rufus Jones was reported to say, that at the end of a Quaker meeting, somebody came in late and said, "When does the service begin?" And he said, "At the rise of meeting." And and I just think that they're two parts, or of they're really one, but they're
Hmm.
just different expressions of one impulse, I think.
That's great. And so, in the intervening years now, you're working for the American Friends Service Committee, where Rufus Jones was, of course, as well.
Yeah.
And so you're seeing not just Quakers but other faith communities do this. And your article also talks about Unitarian Universalists in Denver and interesting model that they have. So can you share a little bit about
Yeah,
the model?
they've developed this model out of. I actually was in Denver last week and got to meet with the Unitarian ministers that developed this model, and they actually were very influenced by Parker Palmer's Circles of Trust, and meeting in these close knit communities, telling stories to really sort of reweave the fabric of community in those circles of trust,
Hmm.
and they were struggling with, the same thing that Quaker meetings have struggled with too, with the sort of activists being over here and the mystics being over here, and these ministers had a real sense of the importance of those things being woven together, and they also had a real sense that, and out of growing out of their own experience, that companioning people that are most impacted by injustice was a really powerful spiritual experience, and also a powerful way to do activism. And so they wanted to put these things together. And so these Unitarian ministers have been creating these small groups of 8 to 12 people, where they come together and they form a sort of covenant. They agree on what they're trying to do, and at their base, they're trying to create restorative justice, because in our culture, retributive justice is so deep in our culture,
Hmm.
that their sense and their theory is that in order to create something else, we have to practice it very intentionally with one another. And so they come together and they agree on a covenant that has to do with trying to create that with each other. And then they decide on an issue. They research an issue that's alive in the community, and that has grassroots people working in it. Sometimes the AFSC is a partner on this, and sometimes others.
Hmm.
Um, and then um, and then they form relationships. The whole thing is very much relationship based. They form relationships with the community most impacted, and they don't take action. This is very different for what Quaker meetings usually think of. We think of a leading, a rising, and then you follow the leading. And this is very much that the leading is coming from the people that are most impacted by injustice, and the sense of what needs to be done to address it. And then you respond to that, and you don't really do anything unless the community asks you to support them some way. um, and these communities, these Denver congregations are most focused on immigrant justice,
Hmm.
and they've helped to support driver's licenses, which actually got undone by some conservative legislators, but they did have a successful law. And then, but also they've been taking people into sanctuary. So Mountain View Meeting has agreed to take an immigrant woman into sanctuary. And then they have this man, Arturo, who's currently in sanctuary at the First Unitarian Church. And he's being supported by the greater faith community, including Quakers, as he's lived for 7 months in this church.
Yeah, explain
In,
sanctuary. So he's actually there in a church, so he can't
Right,
be
right, exactly. So he
deported.
was going to
Yeah.
be deported. His deported
Hmm.
orders came, deportation orders came, and he said that rather than leave his family, he's lived here for a long time. He's a very well regarded and well respected member of the community. He was willing to take a witness and take the risk of going into sanctuary, and this church was willing to support him. And so he's lived in the church for 7 months, and the ICE may, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, they could probably go and take him, but they likely won't because it's very public, and it's
Right.
very
And the
important in
symbolism would be
sanctuary,
pretty
right?
bad
So
to bust
yeah,
into a church. Yeah.
yes, it would. And so he's been living there and hasn't left, and the community's been supporting him and his family. And he's actually, it's been 7 months, and they and and the local agents actually have a lot of discretion to say you don't have to be deported. But for whatever reason, and actually there's been executive actions that say it's okay for people that are not criminals, that have no criminal record, to
Hmm.
not be targets of deportation, but they aren't using their discretion to stop his deportation and to say he gets a stay or he gets to be protected in some other way. And so in a couple weeks, there's going to be a fast, a national fast with Quaker communities and faith community in general will be fasting in solidarity with Arturo. Arturo and his family is going to
With this
fast for
one
3 days.
particular
And
person.
then there's a,
Hmm.
yeah,
Yeah.
and then there's a delegation that's going to go to Washington to lobby ICE to stop his deportation. So there's very more come from this, and model itself is really, so you accompany people, come back to your small group, and you tell the story of what that action has been like and how it impacted and how God was working in that action. And then the community responds to you and asks questions and really considers that together and how the Spirit was working, and then considers how to apply learned from that reflection in the next action. Always spiritual practices and worship that are a part of these meetings. And the first hour of the meetings is spent in that kind of way, and then the second hour is spent in business. So it's very akin to worshiping a longer time in meeting for business before you get to the business. I think that's really what it's parallel to.
Well, and it sounds like it's built in a great listening component there that sort of has not just the people in the church deciding what to do, but to actually find out what the concerns are. And it also reminded me just, their church, by allowing its space to be used like that, is sort of giving some of its privilege over to this person who's in need and in danger.
Right,
That maybe if
right.
it was a Spanish church on the edge of town, the officials wouldn't feel as much compunction about not going in, but a Unitarian church, and it's probably right in the middle of town, so
Yeah,
they
it
can sort
is.
of pass on some of that privilege, perhaps,
Right,
by
exactly.
making
And
these
to and
connections.
to and to make a very public witness as well they're doing it. And I think that's a really important part of the model is learning how to effectively companion people. Because I think as white people, we're used to having a lot of power, we're used to thinking about policy and going and getting it fixed.
Hmm.
And when you really companion and walk with somebody who's impacted, you see a little bit more through their eyes, and how the system works, and how it's really, how they're targeted, and how it's really intractable and very difficult. And then it leads you to take more risks to accompany them in that. I mean, and yes, they're using their privilege. They're not likely to be very hurt by this action, but they are still taking a risk with Arturo.
Sure, and they're sharing the privilege a little too. That it's a little
Right,
harder to do anything
exactly.
with the Unitarians right there. Well, great. Well,
Right.
that's probably about as much time we have here. But you'll definitely, I'm sure, we'll be tweeting and Facebooking out the day of action there and solidarity. So we'll retweet that so any listeners can come.
Great. Great.
And again, this is article Lucy's article is in the June-July issue. So in mailboxes shortly, and it is online on the web and discussions. And you can also on the website hear Lucy reading the article. So many different ways of interacting with Lucy and the article and the whole topic of this French journal. So thank you, Lucy, for being with us.
Yeah.
And
Thanks. It's been a pleasure. And um, yeah, and if anybody wants to learn more about the article, about this process, this model, we have lots of resources available too.
and what's the URL for them to go to?
It's afsc.org/friends/resources.
Great. And we'll have some notes on that. In the show notes, we'll have some URLs as well. So, again, thank you very much, Lucy, for joining us here from
Okay.
across town in Philadelphia. And I'm sure we'll hear from you again
My
soon.
pleasure. My
Bye
pleasure.
bye.